Last time we spoke about the oral law, and we divided it up into three main categories, which are really 5 categories. And we spoke about the first category. So today, in the next half hour or so, we're going to try to speak about the next 2 categories. But I'm hoping there will be lots of questions, and we'll only cover one of them. Okay? So we'll see how it goes.
That.
What?
You know that.
I know that from past experience. Okay? So again, the 3 categories were what we called halacha leMoshe miSinai. These are laws that were given to Moses by God on Mount Sinai. Okay, and that category encompassed 2 things. One was direct laws that were told to Moses. So, for example, tefillin have to be black. Okay, very specific laws. Mostly they have to do with sacrifices. Some of them have to do with tefillin, but very specific laws that do not have a source in the text of the Torah itself. Then we had the second subcategory, which we called Perush Mikubal, which is the accepted explanation, which explain different words or phrases in the Torah which are ambiguous. Bless you.
Like
so, for example, like sign between your eyes, okay? That we learn out from a different way to learn that out. But that's a good example of an ambiguous phrase. But we learn that out from through the second category. Okay, so the examples we gave were the case of the fruit of the beautiful tree, the pre-Eitz Hadar, right? Which our beautiful tree we came up with. So Hesh is very, very from. He chose the etrog. But the rest of us wouldn't necessarily be so religious, and we'd choose things like apples and bananas and pomegranates and mangoes and stuff. So how do we know that the fruit of the beautiful tree means the etrog? So there we had a Perush Makubal that God told Moses on Mount Sinai, that's what it means. Right? And the second example we had was an eye for an eye. That an eye for an eye is not to be literal, that if, God forbid, somebody knocks someone's eye out, you don't just get a poker. Okay? That instead we give a monetary payment of the equivalent value. Okay, that doesn't mean literally you knock somebody's eye out. So both of those are Perush Makubal. They're phrases or words in the Torah which are explained and clarified to Moses on Mount Sinai when he was given the Torah. Yes, Dave?
Just for, are there other subcategories? Because I assume if Perush Mikubal is one,
yeah,
I assume there's other subcategories.
So the 2 subcategories in this section are the actual halacha leMoshe miSinai, those direct laws given to Moses. And then there's the explanations of the text itself. So the main distinction is those which are found in the text, just explained, and those which are not found in the text. Those are the 2 subcategories of the first section.
Got it.
Okay, text or no text.
Right.
Okay, section 2.
And I'm sorry, and
yeah?
Perush Mikubal are the ones not found?
No, those are the ones that are found. Yeah, halacha leMoshe miSinai means it was a law given to Moses on Mount Sinai, right, besides the text of the Torah. Perush Makubal is the explanation of that text when it's ambiguous or unclear.
Okay.
Right, that's to say Perush, it's an explanation. Okay? Category 2 in our system of 3 is basically, take your head, bang it against the wall, figure things out. Okay? We use Svara, we use Drasha, right? We have the 13 attributes of divine exegesis. Okay? I always like that phrase. Okay? The we use those 13 tools to understand the text of the Torah. Okay? And we also have just plain old logic, right? Use your head together, and we're going to speak about that today. And then the third main category is what we call rabbinic legislation, and that's divided into positive and prohibitions. Okay, those are the 2 categories over there. So we're supposed to cover the next 2 sections, right? The sections 2 and 3, both the Svara and Drasha, the analysis of the Torah text, and then also the rabbinic legislation in the next 25 minutes. Okay, so you guys will help me not to finish that, and we'll do it tomorrow as well. Okay, usually they're 2 separate classes. Okay, so let's go through the first category. Okay, we have drashot and svarot. Okay, a drasha, okay, is when you use these 13 attributes of divine exegesis. Okay, and you got to say that a few times. Okay, and you analyze the text of the Torah. So when Moses was on Mount Sinai, he was not just given a certain amount of text. We spoke about that in the first class together, right? He wasn't just given the general rules and principles of all the 613 mitzvahs, but he was given an instruction manual that if you want to derive everything else that there is to be hidden in the Torah scrolls, then what you need to do is you use these 13 tools in order to do it, in order to understand it properly. Now these 13 tools is not a hard and fast rule. There's 13, right? The Gemara gives different ways of categorizing it, right? Hillel said there were 7, right? And one of the other Tanaim said that there were 32 rules. But the common way of categorizing it is 13. But it wasn't that they argued and Hillel said 7, said, well, you can't use the other 6. It was they just categorized it differently. So the way that we commonly categorize it today is the 13 rules. Okay, that's from Rabbi Yishmael. Okay, so Rabbi Yishmael brings the 13 rules, and we'll go through a couple of them. Some of them are very complicated.
What period was Rabbi Yishmael?
Rabbi Yishmael is the Tanaic period. He's the Tanaic period. Yeah.
I once read that there was like 49 ways to depths of the Torah.
That's a different thing. That's a different thing.
Oh, that's separate.
There's 49 ways, or the 70 faces of the Torah, the different ways of understanding the Torah. So that's the applications of those laws. So there's 13 laws, but they can be applied differently, right? I can choose to apply this law in this case, and you can choose to apply a different law. We might have a combination of the laws. Or again, as we said, the 13 laws are really 13 categories. So there's subsets of hundreds of different ways of doing it, right? So 70 is not a hard and fast rule. It doesn't mean that there's only 70 ways to understand the Torah. What it means is that there's more than one way of looking at the Torah. You can't just take a verse and say, this is what the verse means, this is what God wants to tell me. That's part of what God wants to tell you. But there's other ways of understanding the verse as well. But the reason that you have, why does it say 70? Because you can't just look at a verse and say whatever you want to say. You have to follow the rule book of how to understand the Torah properly. And again, the rule book was given by God, who wrote the book, on how to understand what the text has hidden behind it. So we say the number 70 in that there's many different explanations that are legitimate, but there's a limit. You can't just have your preconceived notion and say, well, this is what the Torah means because this is what I want it to say. You have to follow the system, and if you follow the system, then you can have different approaches, and you can have a whole kaleidoscope of looking at the different ways of understanding the Torah. Okay? So, some of these ways of understanding the text. So some of them we saw previously, some of them we've done in the Gemara. Right? One of the things we have is something called a diuk, which is an inference. Right? You can infer something just using your logic. You can infer. If it talks about this case, it's excluding that case. Okay? So into what Josh was going along those lines when we were learning Sukkah earlier. Right? We're talking about this case.
How do you spell it?
In Hebrew, Daled, Yud, Vav, Kuf. There you go. Okay? Bidyuk, with a bet in front. Good. Okay? So we have a diuk. Yeah. Okay, or D-I-Y-Y-U-K. Not that that's useful, but in Hebrew it's better. Daled, Yud, Vav, Kuf. Okay? So that's a logical inference. Okay, we also have a concept that since we know the Torah was written by God, so the Torah has to be a perfect text. But as you go through the Torah, you see certain things that are standing out. So one thing we spoke about earlier, we mentioned the Malbim, right, the 19th century rabbi, German rabbi, the Malbim, who wrote a whole book explaining, using Hebrew grammar, right, different explanations of the oral Torah, how it meshes with the written Torah. So you use Hebrew grammar to go through and say, wait a second, this tense is a little bit out, right? This should have been future tenses and past tense, right? This noun, this verb, they're not conjugated exactly the right way, right? So they'll use that to approach the text that, since we understand the text was given by God, God intended to put those little changes in there because he's trying to show that there's a depth to it, there's something else that's being communicated here other than just the simple understanding. So we use Hebrew grammar for that as well. Okay? Similarly, you'll find very often there's extra words or extra letters or extra prefixes or extra suffixes all over the Torah. Okay? So one of them, or two of them, which we know from Sukkah that we're learning together, is B'shivtecha b'veitecha uv'lechtecha v'derech. Okay, as you're sitting in your home, as you're going on your way. So I don't know how many of you got to the Gemara at that point, but it learns out from the end, it's in your sitting, in your traveling, right? It doesn't just say one is sitting and one is traveling, it's when you are sitting and when you are traveling. And from that, the Gemara learns that it's when you are doing something of your own, right? When I'm going for a walk, or I'm trying to get some exercise, I'm going to bike to Beit Shemesh. So when I'm I'm on my bike trip to Beit Shemesh, okay, then I have to say the Shema, right? But that's only uvlechtecha v'derech, uvlechtecha, right? The suffix over there makes it you, when you're going on your way for your own reasons. But if I'm doing what Hashem wants me to do, right? God wants me to do a mitzvah, so that's not included in the verse. I'm exempt from doing the Shema because I'm involving myself with another mitzvah. Right? So that's what the Gemara learns out, that one who's involved with one mitzvah, they're exempt from doing a second mitzvah because they have an extra suffix in the word that says in your going, right, in your traveling, instead of just when one is traveling. Okay, so we have extra words. Okay, and there's an extra suffix. A case of an extra word, right, is we have one of the 10 commandments is honor thy father and thy mother. Or for modern English, your mother and your father. Okay, so if you look at the Torah, it's kabed, honor, et avicha ve'et imecha, right? Your father and your mother. But there's an extra word there, right? The word et is superfluous. So the Gemara wants to know, why does it say kabed et avicha? Why not just kabed avicha, honor your father? Right? So the Gemara goes and says, that extra word there is to teach you something extra. In this case, one of the opinions is that it teaches you that not only do you have to honor your father, but you actually have to honor your older sibling as well. Okay? So we learn out from these extra suffixes, these extra words, additional aspects of the mitzvahs. Okay? Any questions so far?
Yes.
Yeah.
You mentioned the 13 acts of Jesus.
No?
Or you mentioned it, or the 13
Jesus.
okay.
With phylacteries.
Yeah. And it said so fast. I keep hitting on the Jesus. Is that so that's I wanted to clarify what is that statement that you are saying, and it's because you're not talking about the person.
Right. No, definitely not. No. Exegesis. Like on the board. E-X-E-G-E-S-I-S.
Okay.
Yeah. The Acts of Jesus is a different institution. We definitely don't speak about that. Yeah. Exegesis means.
In our word.
Okay, it's not those words. It's one of the lawyers help me. What's exegesis in normal English? Exegesis is exegesis is like expounding, like to explain or to expound.
Okay.
Yeah, no.
So,
Yeah.
when you talk about how b'shiftecha v'lechtecha,
Yeah.
And then you gave the example of the te'ev et avicha.
Yeah.
So, are both of those tools?
Yeah. Exactly. Both of them are superfluous, and therefore we can say that the Torah is trying to teach us something beyond just the simple reading.
So it's not, because the other one they're kind of different, because the other one you added an extra letter, but the
Correct.
other one was kind of like an extra prefix. Like
Right. One I added a suffix, and one I added a whole new word.
Yeah.
Right. So both of them are legitimate. Sometimes it's an extra letter. You have an extra vav, right? Or sometimes words can be spelled differently, right? Like we mentioned yesterday on Shabbos, right? So I spoke about how ushmartem et matzot, right? That you should guard the matzot, right? And Rashi explains that ushmartem et mitzvot, right? Because mitzvot and matzot are just one vav apart, right? So you can get a depth from that depending how words are spelled.
And that's that's when so the extra vav is in the mitzvah, right? So that's when it's left out.
Mitzvah is the extra one, right? Sometimes it's left out. Depends on how the different spellings.
And sometimes they also only, if it's spelled one way in one circumstance, but they, let's say, remove the vav in another. You
Correct.
Something just from.
Correct, right. You have one word that usually appears in one way, and then you see it's spelled slightly differently somewhere else, so that's telling you something very specific about that second case.
Not that it has to be spelled one way, but because.
Because there's a change, the change is always, anytime you see a change either in grammar or in style or consistency, that's always a red flag that there's something over here that you need to start analyzing to find the depth on it. Okay?
So that is the second.
Exegesis.
This is all, these are just the way of using them.
The second.
I'm not going to go through all 13. These are just different ways of analyzing it. Yeah, these are different ways. Okay? So when we go into the 13 rules, it's easier, right? The 13 rules. Okay?
We're not going through all 13?
We're not going to go through all 13. That would take hours, and some of them are very confusing. You'd like it, you're a lawyer. So I can show you a book. It's a very good book called Gateway to the Talmud, which we have. I can show you. And he goes, I don't know if he goes through all of them. I think he might. That he'll go through all of them and give examples for all of them. But some of them he takes like 3 pages just to explain it. So we'll highlight some of them. Okay? So another way we can analyze the text, and this is done more in the Gemara, right, is something that's logically necessary, right? Just use your logic. So for example, if anyone's learned Bava Kama before, so Bava Kama, okay, Josh, so Bava Kama begins with, these are the 4 head categories of damages. Okay, Arba Avot Nezikin, the 4 head categories of damages. So the Gemara says, well, if you're telling me there's 4 head categories, it must be there's some subcategories. Let's go find out what those are. Right, so that's logically necessary. If there weren't head categories and subcategories, you wouldn't say these are the head categories. Okay, so you can see from that it's just logically necessary. Okay? And other examples, okay, the Gemara will use human behavior, okay, and psychology in order to give a halachic statement. Okay, so for example, we have a mitzvah that if a person finds a lost object, okay, you have to return that lost object to its owner. Okay, but if you're in a certain situation where the owner has given up on ever finding it, so then you don't necessarily have an obligation to return it. Okay, so for example, let's say somebody forgets their pen on the local bus. Okay, unless that's your favorite pen that was given to you by your grandmother or your wife or something like that, okay? That pen's gone, right? Your 50-cent pen, you're not going to go call the bus company and look it up. So if you find a pen, okay, say for example on the bus, you can assume that that person's not looking for it. You don't have to put signs up high missing 50-cent big pen. Okay, but if you find something more specific, right, specific object, for sure, like a wallet, okay, if you, God forbid, forget your wallet on the bus, so you're going to try to get it back, right? You're going to call the bus company, you're going to hope that you find a nice person who found your wallet and didn't take anything, but just found your address on your license and calls you up and finds where you are and returns it to you, right? You assume that you're going to be able to at least try to get it back. So the Gemara goes through different cases and tries to figure out when is it fair to assume a person does not expect to get their stuff back, and when do we assume that they do think they'll be able to get it back, and based on that is whether I have an obligation as the one who found the object to return it or not. Okay, so the Gemara uses psychology in order to analyze this as well. Okay? Now if we want to start with some of the more common of the 13 rules of analyzing the Torah, okay? So we have something called a Gezerah Shava. Okay, a Gezerah Shava. Okay, a Gezerah Shava, Gimel, Zayin, Resh, Hey, Gezerah. Okay, and the next word is Shin, Vav, Hey, Shava, which means equal. Okay, Gezerah Shava is when I have two words, okay, in two different verses, okay, and I use a Gezerah Shava to connect those two words. So one verse might be talking about Shabbat, and one verse might be talking about idol worship. Shabbat and idol worship don't necessarily have too much to do with each other, but because they each have this specific word, so I connect those two words together, and I now can use that bridge that I've created to make analogies between the two cases.
Would that be like the Sukkah where they're talking about Shema? They're bringing Shema to learn how...
That's something different that we're going to get to. That's something different. That's something called a binyan of. We're going to speak about that also. Right, Gezerah Shava means I have two verses in the Torah that each have the same specific word, and I can connect those two words together in order to say that a concept that applies in case A also now applies in case B. Okay, that's a Gezerah Shava that's very common. Okay, Gezerah Shava, there was a set list of words that the rabbis had that you could make these Gezerah Shavas from, so I can't just pick whichever words I want. Okay, but they weren't told which words to connect. So they had to figure out from this list of words, so let's say I have a word, right? One of the examples, the most famous example probably is the word kicha, which means to take. Okay, so I know this word kicha is on my list. So where in the Torah does it say the word kicha, and which two verses am I connecting, and what is the halacha I'm trying to learn from one to the other? You have to go figure that out. Again, there's different rules on how to do it and how you can do that. Okay, so that's a Gezerah Shava. Okay, something similar to a Gezerah Shava, there's three that are very similar, is something called a hekesh. Okay, hey, I think yud kuf shin. Okay, a hekesh. Okay, might not be a yud there. Okay, a hekesh is a connection. So sometimes I have a verse that speaks about two mitzvahs that have nothing to do with each other, but they appear in the same verse. So you'll ask, then why did God put these two things that have nothing to do with each other in the same verse? And the answer is because they do have something to do with each other, right? And if you have these two things that are in the same verse together, again, we can make a connection between the two, and we can learn something that applies to the first one, applies to the second one as well. Okay? That also can happen if you have two verses which are next to each other, which have nothing to do with each other. Okay? You have a whole paragraph about this one mitzvah, and then the Torah switches to a totally different mitzvah. So we can learn also a hekesh, that because these two subjects are brought right next to each other, so again, you can make a connection between the two as well. Right? So the placement in the Torah is very, very important. Okay? What Josh is mentioning, what we saw in the Gemara in Sukkah, is called a binyan av. Okay? A binyan av is when I have a specific halacha, okay, that is mentioned in one case, and I can then expand it in a general form to apply to all the other mitzvahs. So that's what we have by Sukkah, right? We have a specific case in the mitzvah of reciting the Shema, right? That certain categories of people are exempt at certain times, and then we expand that to apply in all sorts of other cases. And usually what you have to do is you have to try to find the common thread between the initial mitzvah where this idea is brought and the other places I'm trying to expand it to. Okay, so that's called a binyan av. So these are all ways that we connect different specific laws about different mitzvahs to other mitzvahs within the whole system of the Torah. Okay? Other things we can have is we have another thing called when you have two verses which exclude something. So we say they come to exclude every other case. So what does that mean? If the Torah tells me that I have to do a specific thing, but I don't do it on Thursdays. Okay? For whatever reason. Thursdays we don't do this mitzvah. Okay? Now, you might be able to expand that and say, okay, good, I see this mitzvah, I don't do it on Thursdays. It seems similar to a different mitzvah. Maybe that mitzvah also I can use what we just said, either a binyan of, maybe it's next to each other in the verses. And I'll say the second mitzvah also doesn't apply on Thursdays. Okay? So the Torah, what we'll do is it'll tell you both by mitzvah A and mitzvah B. Mitzvah A doesn't apply on Thursdays. Mitzvah B also doesn't apply on Thursdays. Once I have two verses which are telling me the same exclusionary principle, I know that I can no longer exclude anything else. So if mitzvah 1 doesn't happen on Thursdays, and the Torah explicitly tells me that, and then the Torah goes out of its way to tell me a second time by mitzvah B that also doesn't apply on Thursdays, because the Torah is specified in those two cases, I know that there's no other mitzvah that I don't do on Thursdays. Okay? So that's called when I have two identical exclusions appearing explicitly in the Torah, then we say it doesn't apply to any other case. Okay, there's another one of the rules. Okay, so as you see, there's just logical ways of analyzing the text. Okay? Now we go on to something that people are more familiar with, but they're actually much less significant, something called gematria. Okay, gematria is that in Hebrew, we don't have numbers in Hebrew. Right? Each letter has a corresponding numerical value. So an aleph is 1, and a bet is 2, and a yud is 10, and then chaf is 20.
Oh.
All right, we'll go by tens. Okay? Then we go by hundreds.
No, I was thinking.
Kuf is 100. Okay? So we go. So all the letters correspond to a number. So you can take words, right, and you can apply their numerical value to them, and you can learn something from them. So there's a couple famous ones. One we already mentioned this morning, right? Tzitzit, right? The word tzitzit has a numerical value of 600, because the tzadi is 90, the yud is 10, and then you have another tzadi yud, so it's 200. And then a taf at the end, tzitzit, is 600. And then, as we said, there's 5 knots and 8 strings, and together you have 613, so tzitzit is connected to the whole 613 mitzvot. Okay? Another one we have is that Jacob, right, he says that when he lived with his uncle Laban, right, who was not such a positive character in the Torah, right, so he says, Im Lavan Garti, right, with Lavan I lived. Okay, he spent time with Lavan, he married Lavan's daughters, right? So on there, Rashi brings from the Gemara that Im Lavan Garti, if you take this word Garti, Gimel Reish Taf Yud, so if you take the numerical value and rearrange the letters, so it's Taf Reish Yud Gimel, which is 613. So when Yaakov says, I lived with Lavan, what he's really saying is not only did I live with Lavan, right, because you can use different words for living, right, but Im Lavan Garti, I lived with my uncle Lavan, is saying not only did I just live with him, but I have 613, I kept all the 613 mitzvot, even though I was living with such an evil person. That no matter where I was always careful to make sure I kept all the 613 mitzvot. Okay, so we have these all over. People like to use gematrias because they're interesting. They make you think. Okay, but the truth is that gematrias are not one of the ways that we analyze the Torah. Okay, they're good for bringing out ideas, right? But in terms of a halachic application, so we don't use gematrias for halachic applications. Okay, so they're good for, giving you different philosophical ideas or different ways of analyzing, but they don't have an application in halacha in almost every case. Okay, they're what the Torah calls like the desserts of the Torah, right?
It's also Kabbalistic, maybe?
Right, okay, Kabbalistic is different. Kabbalistic can sometimes be halachic. There's a whole interface between Kabbalah and halacha, which we're going to speak about on Sunday, on the last day. Speak a little bit about that.
Would you say it's fair that Kabbalah uses gematria?
Sometimes. Sometimes it does. But sometimes you'll have a halachic, sort of like a gray area, there's different opinions, and halacha might weigh in on that. I might say, according to Kabbalah, for different reasons, which even I don't understand, right? The Kabbalah says that you should follow this particular opinion. And the question is, well, if we have a halachic system, and then we have a Kabbalah system, so how do those two interface? Right? If I have a halacha, right, and I have a dispute, and the Kabbalah comes in and tells me that the Kabbalah says it should go a certain way, well, is that like a trump card that, okay, we always follow the Kabbalah? Or do we say, no, they're two separate systems, it doesn't matter what the Kabbalah says? Right? Or does it have a different way of interacting? So we're going to speak about that a little bit on Sunday, if we get to it, on how Kabbalah interacts with our normal halachic system.
How do you write gematria?
In Hebrew?
Yes.
Gimel Mem, Taf Reish, Yud Hey, I think. Gematria, I think so. Okay? So that is the gematrias, okay? And then we have the last one of the 13 general rules, okay, is when you have the Torah tells me a very general thing, and then tells me something very specific, or something specific and then something general. So there's ways of analyzing what are we coming to include and exclude, and which cases can I derive from here. So for example, the Torah might tell me that you have to go and feed your sheep, your oxen, your cows, and feed all your animals. Right? So it started with some very specific cases, right? Your sheep, your oxen, your cows. And then it went to a very general case, and all your animals. So the obvious question is, well, why, if it's all your animals, so why don't you just tell me go feed all your animals? Why do you have to specify these cases? So there's different ways of analyzing it, whether the specific cases came before the general cases or the general came before the specific. Sometimes you have specific, general, specific. Sometimes you have general, specific, general, right? So there's all different patterns in how you do it, and there's different rules on how we analyze it to show what's really included, what's really excluded, and what cases we can expand it to. Okay? So that's category 2. That's what takes up most of the Gemara. Most of the oral law is using these rules, using logic, using Hebrew grammar, and applying it to the text of the Torah in order to derive and discover all of the depth that's really hidden within the Torah itself. Okay? Any questions on this category? Or we can jump to rabbinic legislation. Okay, so you didn't let me do it in 2 classes. We'll do it in 1. Okay. Rabbinic legislation. So besides the 613 mitzvot, we also have something called rabbinic legislation, which means the rabbis come along and they give us new halachas, new laws. Sometimes they're positive and sometimes they're prohibitive. Okay? So the first question that we have to ask is, says who? Who says you can just make up things? In fact, we have a prohibition in the Torah, right? There's 2 mitzvahs. You're not allowed to add, you're not allowed to subtract from the mitzvahs. There's 613, not 612 and not 614. So if the rabbis are coming and giving us all these additional mitzvahs, aren't they in violation of the prohibition that you're not allowed to add mitzvahs to the Torah? Right? We have 613 mitzvahs. Now all of a sudden we have Chanukah. So Chanukah is mitzvah 614. That means every time we're doing Chanukah, we're violating a Torah mitzvah and adding a mitzvah. We're not allowed to do that. So how did this come about? So we have a verse in Leviticus 18:30, which I don't have in front of me here, but it's the last verse in the Parsha 18:30. Yeah, the last verse in Parsha Acharei Bot. Okay, and it says, "Ushmartem es mishmarti," and you should guard my guarding. Okay, that you should put a fence up around my fence. Okay, so from there we derive that the rabbis have the ability to put up a fence around the laws itself of the Torah, right? Because the Torah says, "And you should put up a fence around my fences." So those are the prohibitive rabbinic legislations. Okay. So, for example, we have different cases where the Torah prohibits a very specific case, and the rabbis will come along and say, well, we should also prohibit a very similar case because you might come to do the case that's actually prohibited by the Torah because they're so similar. So, for example, on Shabbat, we're not allowed to write. Okay? It's one of the 13 categories of forbidden work on Shabbat is you're not allowed to write. But on a Torah level, you're only not allowed to write with your right hand, or if you're a lefty, with your left hand. Okay? You're not allowed to write with your right hand. But your left hand is considered something that's out of the ordinary, and therefore, strictly speaking, on a Torah level, you would be allowed to write with your left hand. But if we let people write with their left hand, so what are you going to do when you get tired? You're automatically going to switch the pen to your right hand. So therefore, the rabbi said, we're not going to allow people to write even with their left hand, because we want to make sure that they don't come to accidentally write with their right hand. Okay, so we're expanding the law that prohibits writing with your right hand to include also the left hand, because you see how someone could easily make that mistake. Okay? Similarly, the one that everyone's not so excited about, the Torah prohibits eating meat and milk. Okay, so you can't have meat. But meat in the Torah means cow, sheep, lamb. Okay, that's meat. Chicken's not meat, chicken's bird. Okay? So on a Torah level, you're allowed to have chicken parmesan. Right? But people mix up meat and poultry, right? They're sold in the same section of the supermarket. Right? So people come to mix up meat and poultry. And therefore, they added a prohibition that you're also not allowed to eat chicken with milk as well. Okay, so that's an expansion of the Torah law in order to protect and make sure people don't make a mistake and violate the Torah law. Okay, the last example is on Shabbat. We have a prohibition called muksa. There's certain objects that you're not allowed to move. Right? And most of those objects, there's different categories, but a lot of those categories are objects of things that their primary use is something prohibited on Shabbat. Okay, so for example, right, a pen. Right? Going back to our first case, right? A pen is used to write with. That's generally what you use a pen for. So, in order to protect that people don't accidentally go to write on Shabbat, so therefore the rabbis have created this thing called muksa, where you're not allowed to even move a pen. So now I'm definitely not going to write because I'm not even going to touch the pen. Okay, so those are all different cases where the rabbis came along and they added fences around the pre-existing Torah laws in order to prevent somebody from accidentally violating one of the Torah prohibitions. Okay? So that's very good for the prohibitive
I
one.
have a question. What
Yeah.
is the actual process for making, or should I say, passing rabbinic law?
Okay, very good.
How does that come into fruition?
Okay, very good. So we don't have it anymore because you need the Sanhedrin, the High Court, basically has to declare that this is now a new law. So we don't have a High Court today. So basically they would deliberate and then they would come out at the end and they would make a decision on how to do it. Sometimes it wasn't Sanhedrin, sometimes it was the collection of rabbis that were available at the time. But we don't have the authority to do it today. We don't have a Sanhedrin, we don't have those type of court systems, so we can't do it today. What they would do is they would convene a tribunal, I guess, right? And then they would enact it for the whole Jewish people. Okay, so you'd have to have a specific Beit Din take care of it. Okay?
So it's no longer.
Today we don't have it. Our Beit Din today is of a much lesser authority than the Beit Din of previous times. Right? We're missing something called smicha, right? Smicha is when you become a rabbi, you get smicha, right? It's the name for the. You get a Juris Doctor when you became a lawyer, right? So you get a smicha when you become a rabbi. So the smicha we have today is sort of like imitation, right? Real smicha means that you have a tradition from a person who has a tradition, from this person who has a tradition, all the way back to Moshe himself, that he has taught you and that he's given you the authority in order to do a whole bunch of things, specifically sit on a particular Beit Din. Now that tradition was lost at a certain time. So our smicha today doesn't reflect the idea that you can sit on a specific Beit Din. It just means that you're a rabbi, that you pass certain tests, that you're qualified to now to teach Torah, right? Or to be a rabbi of a shul type of thing. But in order to actually be on a Sanhedrin, right, on a high court that has all these powers, so you need a what we call the real smicha, which needs to be transferred from rabbi to student, and that chain was broken about 1,500 or more years ago.
But no.
Did that answer your question?
Yeah, so it was just broken, but could rabbinic law be overruled at certain points?
Yes. Rabbinic law can be overruled. Okay, we're going to see that's only going to be with the positive rabbinic enactments. The negative rabbinic enactments, they're there to stay.
But
the positive ones we can.
what about if we
Judges.
don't have the Sanhedrin anymore? How did, I think it was Rabbi Feinstein maybe, that came to rule that electricity acts like fire.
So that's a different thing. That's the idea that what do we do today, and again this is what we're going to speak about tomorrow and Sunday, is we don't have a Sanhedrin, so what do? So we go to the local rabbi, right, and we go to the highest authority, the most knowledgeable person, and we ask them to figure out what the halacha is. But it's not that they made a decree to add new things. Is that they take the existing sources and apply it to the modern cases, and we go by the biggest experts of the generation, and we ask them, okay, we have this new thing that we just discovered called electricity, right? How are we supposed to treat that on Shabbat? Are you allowed to use it on Shabbat? You're not allowed to use it on Shabbat. And they'll go through the Gemara, and they'll apply the principles to the modern cases and figure out whether it's permissible or not. And that's what we do today, right? The whole halachic process, how that works in modern times, we're going to speak about that on Sunday as well. That's part of the Kabbalah discussion as well. Okay? So these are the prohibitive rabbinic enactments, okay? And again, there's certain rules that they have to follow. Okay? You can't just have the rabbis can't just get up and do everything. We have a little bit of democracy over here, okay? So some of it is that it has to be accepted by the masses, right? So sometimes the Sanhedrin might get around, they might enact something, but people just aren't capable of taking care of it, right? Nobody's following it. So if nobody's following it, it defeats the whole purpose. So therefore, it never takes hold. So it has to be something that the people, right, that's us, accept upon themselves as well. Okay, so that's one rule. Okay, second, it has to be clear when they do it that this rule is only a rabbinic law, it's not a Torah law. Because if they were to declare this is a new Torah law, then they would be in violation of the prohibition of adding a 614th mitzvah. So I have to make it very clear that this mitzvah is only rabbinic. And there's certain differences between rabbinic and Torah mitzvahs. So for example, if you have a doubt regarding a Torah mitzvah, so let's say you just had your bread meal and you were going to do the Birkat HaMazon at the end. Okay? And then you had a doubt as to whether you said it or not. You don't remember, right? You were at the meal, you think you said the Birkat HaMazon, you don't remember. So because it's a Torah mitzvah, you have to go back and do it again. Okay? You're in a situation of doubt, you have to be strict and do it again. But if you have a rabbinic mitzvah, okay, so for example, a different bracha, right? You're not sure if you said a bracha before you had a drink of water. Okay? So then, ideally what you do is you try to find somebody else to say the bracha for you. Okay? But if you're, in the middle of the bike ride to Beit Shemesh and no one's coming for an hour, okay, and you really need that drink of water, So then if you have a doubt as to whether you've said the bracha or not, so you're allowed to drink even without reciting a bracha, if you're in a situation of doubt. Okay, so that's because it's rabbinical. That's the main difference between rabbinical and Torah mitzvahs. Okay? Now when we come to the positive rabbinical enactments. So again, we spoke about what are the common positive ones, right? We have Purim, we have Hanukkah, right? We have lots of other mitzvahs that are positive mitzvahs that are rabbinical legislation. So where do those come from? So there we have another verse, right? That says, She'el avicha v'yagedcha, right? Ask your father and he will tell you what to do, right? And that says that there are positive things that the leaders of the Jewish community can enact for us in order to help us build a relationship with God. So just like we spoke about, or Rav Gav spoke about, that if you're in a loving relationship with someone, you want to do more for them, you want to connect with them. So too, there's certain things that we want to do more, we want to connect more with God.
But would that still have the weight of a mitzvah? Because otherwise that would seem to be like a 614th.
Right, so we have to be clear again that they're rabbinical. Right, so it's very clear that Hanukkah is a rabbinical mitzvah. It has to be clear. Okay? So these mitzvahs can be repealed. Okay? If you have a Beit Din that is greater in number and in wisdom than the original Beit Din that set it up, they can repeal a positive rabbinic enactment. Okay, so for these we do have a system in order to repeal it if necessary.
But if the tradition is that the further away we go from the source, that we're losing that authority, how could you ever have one that's
nowadays we can't.
Wisdom?
Nowadays we can't. But when you're closer to the time, then they could have done it. Then they could have done
even
it.
the Amoraim could have overruled the Tanaim?
The Amoraim could overrule the other Amoraim. Right? Or the Tanaim could overrule other Tanaim. Now we're so far from that generation, that level of knowledge, so that we're not able to do it. We don't even have a proper Beit Din. Right? So let alone having people qualified. We don't have the Beit Din to be qualified. But there is that system is built in order to do it. Okay? One thing that comes up a lot with rabbinical mitzvahs is that sometimes you have a reason that the rabbinical mitzvah was given, right? And sometimes that reason doesn't apply. So sometimes the Gemara says the reason doesn't apply and therefore the rabbinical mitzvah falls away and you don't have to worry about it. And sometimes we have a situation called lo plug, which means no distinction. We don't distinguish whether the reason applies or the reason doesn't apply. We follow the rabbinical mitzvah no matter what. So the question is, well, how am I supposed to tell? When do I have to go by the reason of the rabbinical mitzvah? And when do I say the reason is irrelevant? Okay? So the way we do it is that when the mitzvah, the rabbinical enactment took place, you have to look at the wording of what did they proclaim to the people. So if they went out and said, there's a new mitzvah, and the mitzvah is that we read the Megillah on Purim. Okay? That's all we're telling you. In that case, no matter what happens, even if we find out what the reason that they declared that mitzvah for, even if that reason falls away, it doesn't apply due to society, culture, history, whatever the reason is, nevertheless, that mitzvah still applies. You have to do that rabbinical mitzvah. But sometimes the rabbis will come out and say, you have to do this mitzvah because of this reason. So if when they declared the mitzvah, they said, this is the reason we're enacting it, then the reason for the enactment is built into the law. And therefore, if the reason doesn't apply anymore, then you don't have to follow that law anymore. So it depends on how they went about in order to do it, in order to enact it. Did they enact it with or given the reason? Or did they enact it without the reason? And there's a very interesting Gemara where the Gemara speaks about how they set up a certain rabbinical law. And one of the Tanaim or Amoraim, I forget which one, wasn't there. He missed the meeting. And he says, what's the reason for this? He said, we're not telling you. He says, is it this? He says, we're not telling you. Maybe it's that? No, I'm not telling you. He says, what do you mean you're not telling me? You missed the meeting. We don't tell anybody what the law is for a certain amount of time until the law is taken hold. Afterwards, we'll tell you what the reason is, because this rabbinical law, we want it to apply even when the reason doesn't apply. Okay, so we're not telling you the reason, right? Because that way you'll say, oh, it only applies in this time. Right? It applies at all times. Okay, so you have different mitzvahs. Sometimes you even have different disputes, even between some of the later sources when it's not clear whether it applies or not. Okay, so for example, right, one of you asked me yesterday, at the end of the meal, so we passed around a little cup and we washed our hands at the end of the meal. So that's called mayim achronim, or the waters of the after part of the meal, right? We know we wash before a bread meal. Some people wash after a meal before they do the Birkat HaMazon as well. So why do some people do it and some people don't? So the reason that the Gemara gives for why we do that is because there was a certain type of salt which came from Sodom, right, from Sodom, right, which was very dangerous. And if that salt touches your eyes, so it could blind you. So because people used to eat, I guess it tastes good, it, I don't know, worked very well to add flavoring. So what you do is you'd wash your hands afterwards, because if you're because of the danger, to make sure that you don't touch your eyes. Okay, now, anybody had any sodomite salt lately? Right, anyone get salt in your eyes? Right, we're all, Baruch Hashem, we can all see still. So Tosfot comes along and says, we don't have sodomite salt, right? Again, Tosfot speaking in, France and Germany in the, 12th, 13th centuries. So he says, we don't have sodomite salt anymore. So there's no reason to wash your hands before you do Birkat HaMazon. We have the reason why. The reason doesn't apply, so we don't need to do it anymore. Right? Other commentaries come along and say, no, that wasn't the only reason that was there. There's another idea that you want to prepare yourself, just like before you pray, right? In the morning we wash our hands to prepare ourselves. So before we go to speak to God, we like to wash our hands as well. So too, before we do Birkat HaMazon, we're also going to wash our hands, because that's also a prayer. In fact, it's a biblical obligation to do. So therefore, we're like preparing ourselves and cleaning ourselves in preparation for speaking with God. So you have a dispute even today that some communities, they do wash their hands before Birkat HaMazon and some don't. And that's based on this understanding, do we go only by the reason given explicitly in the Gemara as to why this was set up? Or do we say that there are other reasons that weren't necessarily told to us, and therefore the mitzvah will apply in any case? Okay, so that, in a summary, is rabbinic legislation. So that brings to a close the three sections: the Halacha L'Moshe Misinai, the explicit laws given to Moses on Mount Sinai. The second section is the Svara and Drasha, right? The different tools that we have in order to analyze the text of the Torah. And again, that's the bulk of the oral law, the bulk of the Gemara. And then finally, rabbinic legislation. So we spoke a bit about the authority of where the rabbis got the authority to do it, some of the limits on what they're allowed to do as well. Okay, next time we'll speak about the halachic process, and it'll turn to more of a history lesson. And we'll do that for the next few classes. We'll speak about the history of how we get from Moses on Mount Sinai to the year 2014. How does the halachic process work over that time period?